Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Kathleen Morley and I in this part one of a two-part series of practical training for project managers and supervisors. This presentation is going to be an hour. It'll go from 12 to 1 o'clock. And before we start, let me introduce ourselves. My name is George Pallas. Many of you know who I am. I'm the managing partner of Cohen, Seglius, Pallas, Greenall, and Furman. With me today as a co-presenter is my partner, Kathleen Morley. Kathleen is a partner in our construction group as well. Okay, Kathleen.
Everyone, yes, hi, welcome. I just want to let you all know that if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, you can enter them in the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer them either as they come, or we'll save them at the end and try and answer all of them. So you can just enter them in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Kathleen. So before we get started, let me just give you 30 seconds on who we are. For those of you who do not know, Cohen Seglius is one of the largest construction litigation firms in the United States. We are, in fact, recently we're just ranked number 6 by the Associated Building and Contractors Executive Magazine, with over 50 attorneys practicing exclusively in construction. We represent many construction companies all the way up the supply chain, from supplier to the large multinational CMs. We've tried cases all over the country. We currently have 75 lawyers, 50 of which do nothing but construction, in offices up and down the eastern, in the Mid-Atlantic area, as far west as Kentucky. So that's who we are. So the topics of the two-part seminar that we're going to be providing, it really is about project management training. The first part is going to be talking about the critical components of successful project management, as well as and really focusing on the changes provisions in your contract on how you get paid for doing extra work that's beyond the scope of the contract. In part 2, which is going to happen in April, we'll be speaking more about contract, more important contract provisions, as well as various claims that will be can be asserted by the contractor or against the contractors, and how to best protect yourselves from those claims. So that'll be in part 2. So let me move, if I can, and speak just generally about some of the critical components of successful project management. As I said, we're going to start this part 1 really focuses on the changes provision. And so you would think, and it sounds pretty simple, right? But to be a very effective project manager, the first thing that you need to know is have a complete and full understanding of what your scope of work is. Now that may sound silly that I'm saying that, but you would be surprised of how many project managers across the country don't have a full appreciation of what their entire scope of work is. And that's critically important. Because once you are fully aware of your scope of work, you have to ensure that your field personnel also have a full understanding of that scope of work. And also to understand the assumptions that your estimating department relied upon in preparing its bid estimate for the project in order to perform that work. And those assumptions relate to, obviously to access, storage, laydown areas, and things of that nature, sequence, schedule. You need to know all those assumptions in order to be an effective project manager. Another very important component is you need to have absolute regular communication with your field crew with respect to any conditions that may arise in the field that may require the performance of additional work that you believe is outside the scope of your contract. And that may entitle you to time or extra money for performing this extra work. So that's very, very important to have regular communication with your field superintendent, foremen, so that you fully understand what's happening in the field when it is happening. Once you have that understanding and having that regular communication, it's very important that you're able to promptly identify circumstances that give rise to extra work or any other changes in your scope of work. And the reason why it's important for you to identify it is because once you identify a condition that requires extra work, that will immediately trigger the notice requirements under your contract. And therefore, you'd have to be fully cognizant of what those notice requirements are so that you can satisfy them. And they are set forth in your contract. Equally, and probably it's equally as important as the notice, and something that where contractors fail routinely, is that they do not effectively and comprehensively track the costs of performing extra work. It's one thing to do extra work at a directive of an upper tier contractor, but to get paid for it, that's where the art is. That's where it requires really focusing and the skills of a good project manager to make sure that you have all the tools that are necessary in order to get paid. And it's not just the notice of the claim, but also the proof. And if you do what we're going to show in this part one, there's no reason for you not to get paid all the money that you have incurred to perform this extra work. So what are the kind of skills that a good project manager must have in handling these changes? You must know what's happening in the field at all times. Your field superintendents and foremen need to be in communication with you so they can identify for you circumstances that are giving rise in the field that would warrant a compensation for performing extra work. It's critically important. And once you have that communication and are aware of it, then it's properly identified, then you can provide the proper notice, proper tracking in order for you to get paid for doing that extra work. And that's critically important. So what are the consequences if you do not do so? Well, you know what those consequences are. It's not a surprise, right? You will have cost overruns, you'll have labor inefficiencies, you'll greatly diminish your ability to recapture or recover these costs. You will perhaps waive your rights to recover these costs of performing extra work. All of this happens if, as a project manager, you are not doing the fundamentals of knowing what your scope of work is, communicating with your field personnel, providing the appropriate notice, and tracking the costs associated with performing that work. So we're going to speak to you a little bit about how to handle these changes during a project, right? When you get a change in scope. Anytime there's a change in scope, you're going to have that with respect to, it can be anywhere from the supplier to the CM, who may be affected by it, right? But once there's a change in that scope of work, it absolutely immediately triggers the notice requirements in your contract, right? It really does. And in those notice requirements, there's typically a very small, narrow window by which you need to provide that proper notice, right? So it's very, very important to be aware of it, be aware of the notice requirements so that you can properly provide that notice in a timely fashion, right? And that's what the focus is. So the best way to explain, and go through these the changes provision in the contract is the use of three different scenarios. Kathleen will speak to you about scenario one. I'll speak to you about scenario two. Kathleen will speak to you about scenario three. And these are things that happen all the time. We're intimately familiar with them. It happens on every single project. How you best protect the company's interests is what we're here to talk about. So Kathleen, let me turn it over to you to talk about scenario one.
Okay, thank you, George. So scenario one, here is the setup for us to discuss scenario one. In scenario one, owner and contractor agree that a specific condition was not contemplated by the contract documents. Owner and contractor agree that extra work is required. So in scenario one, there's an agreement on both sides that something that was not contemplated by the contract documents and that extra work is going to be required by the contractor. So the owner then verbally tells you to make the change, but not to worry about the paperwork at this time because the job is on a tight schedule. So he or she wants you to hurry up and just get on with the extra work. The question here is, are you obligated to accept that verbal direction and perform the change? So here you might think the answer is yes, but the answer technically is no. And let's talk about why that's the case. So under the AIA, here a sample provision from the A201, the 2017 version, the definition of change orders. Under the AIA typical provisions, a change order is defined as a written instrument prepared by the architect and signed by the owner, contractor, and architect stating their agreement upon all of the following: the change in the work, the amount of the adjustment, if any, in this contract sum, and any time adjustment. So that is how the AIA defines a change order technically. So what does that mean? The best practice here would be when this circumstances arises, when you agree there's extra work, everyone agrees that it's a change, but the owner's telling you to proceed without a change order. You want to notify the owner confirming in writing of the changed condition. You then want to send a change order request to the owner. You want to wait for a signed change order. Best case scenario, ideally, you want to wait for that signed change order. Most contracts, in fact, will expressly state that the contractor is not entitled to compensation for change conditions without an executed change order. However, in the typical scenario when the owner requires the contractor to immediately begin the change work, but a change order can't be issued before the work begins, are you obligated to proceed? Should you proceed with that change work? The best practice here is to demand that the owner provide you with a written directive to proceed with the work under the agreed upon terms that you guys have agreed upon verbally. If the owner does not, then you should send a written communication, send an email to the owner's representative, the owner or GC, depending on your position. If you're a sub, we'll be talking about the GC here. Those terms here can be interchanged. You send them an email confirming in writing what the two of you agreed upon. And then you want to follow up and submit a change order request that reflects those agreed upon terms.
And Kathleen, let me jump in if I just can on this one point, just to highlight something. In almost every single contract that you're signing, it says expressly that if you proceed with extra work without an executed change order in your possession, you will have waived your claim to assert a recovery of those costs. That's in your contract. Now, so many of you are thinking, if you have to wait for an executed change order to go up the chain and come back down to me, I'm going to not get the job done. It's going to be interfering the job. I'm going to be a problematic contractor. I understand that. That's the business side. So the lawyer is going to tell you the contract says what it says. You need a contract. You need a change order in your hand before you proceed. The business, wearing the business hat, is what Kathleen just laid out, which is controlling the dialogue in writing, confirming your conversation in writing with your client, confirming the scope, the price, and the time in writing. And why is that so important? Remember, when you send a writing to someone else, they have three choices. They can accept it and write back and say, hey, thank you. That's exactly the way we planned. That exactly accurately reflects our conversation. They can write back and say, what are you talking about? We never agreed to that, or we never agreed to a part of it. Or they're silent. If they're silent, the law is going to assume that they agreed with what you wrote in your writing. It gives you protection. And that's why it's very important that you do that. You have the power within your hands to do that. What you don't want to do is to proceed without protecting your interests. Now, when do you use that? Think about it. You have a client that is rock solid. You do work 20 years with this client. In that scenario, you're more apt to send the email confirming the terms of your agreement and you proceed. It makes complete sense, right? That's the business reality. But let's say you're dealing with a bum contractor that's giving you a lot of hard time on the entire job, slow pay, not processing paperwork, it's problematic, and your spidey senses are tingling, telling you have a problem. Well, guess what? Under the law and under the contract, you can find protection in not proceeding with the work until such time that you have a change order in hand. Use it both ways. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you, George. Great points. Okay, so continuing with scenario one, should a contractor make changes on its own in order to maintain the progress of the work without notifying the owner or the GC? No. And why would that not be the case? Why would you not want to do that? There are multiple reasons that you would not want to do that and just proceed with the change without even raising an issue or notifying the owner or GC that you've encountered this change condition or the extra work. One, the owner or the GC has been deprived of its ability to assess the condition and implement different changes to mitigate the impact. It's their right to assess the situation and decide if there's a different way to go about it that might mitigate the costs associated with it. Also, the contractor or sub may have waived its ability to seek what otherwise would have been a valid change order request associated with the change. So you don't want to do that. The owner could suffer damages as a result of the change. It might affect other trades work, or it might result in other unforeseen damages that you weren't contemplating. So you never want to just proceed with extra work or changed work without notifying the owner or GC, notifying up the chain that it's been encountered. So this is an excerpt from Bruner and O'Connor. It's a well-recognized construction law authority that's out there, and this just is a clause from their treatise, essentially, that confirms what we've just talked about. And there they say the contractor is required to give written notice of any claim for increases in the contract sum before proceeding to execute the work giving rise to the claim, unless there is an emergency endangering life or property. So really these clauses, that's typically what is going to be required. You are obligated to give notice of this change unless it's an emergency situation. Bruner and O'Connor go on to say, while these notice before proceeding with the work clauses may be waived, they are quite often enforced. The clauses are not particularly burdensome as they require only that the contractor provide notice before undertaking the work. Furthermore, the element of prejudice is often present where a contractor or subcontractor fails to inform the party for whom it is doing work that it believes certain work is beyond the scope of its engagement before undertaking the work. So that basically just solidifies the concept that we just talked about. So continuing on with scenario one, what if a change order has not been issued by the time you prepare your next payment application? What should you do in that instance? Are you entitled to payment for the change order request? Should you include the open COR on your payment application? What do you think? Here, the best practice, and this is not often done, and it's a very good practice to undertake. You want to identify the changed work on the payment application by listing the open change order request and include a copy with the payment application. So why would you want to do that? That is just another opportunity for you to remind the contractor or the owner that that change order request is out there, it's pending, and you're expecting to get paid for it. So you took the opportunity when the circumstances arose, you confirmed in writing your verbal agreement with the contractor or the owner about this being extra work. You are going to proceed and what the contract price change and any time extension is going to be, what you two have agreed upon. Then you're going to later follow up and submit the change order request like we talked about. Then when it comes time for your payment application, you're going to again list that open COR, include a copy with it, and it's just a reminder that you are looking to get paid. So there's no question.
And Kathleen, if I could just jump in for a moment. Kathleen asked the question, are you entitled to be paid? So you have a great client, they tell you to get out there, work, do the extra work, you give them a price, everyone agrees to it, you send the email, it's all confirmed, everyone's thumbs up, you prepare a change order request, you submit it in. Are you entitled to be paid? No, you don't have a change order. Remember what Kathleen showed you initially. The change order is a written instrument signed by everybody that modifies the contract. The COR, the change order request, is simply a claim. So until you get a change order, you're not entitled to be paid. So why bother attaching it to the pay application? We recommend that's identified. Do not look at the first page of your pay app and change the contract balance to the adjusted contract balance to factor in the value of the COR. That'll immediately result in rejection of the pay application. You're simply identifying it on the bottom and the second page of your pay application, the schedule of values, identifying the CO work, the work was done, percent it was done. You're not looking to get paid for it. It's really about identifying the value, the percent that is complete. So it's another notice requirement to the contractor that you are not proceeding with that work pursuant to it as a volunteer, but you're intending to be paid. That's why we identify it as a matter of best practices. But you are not going to be paid for it. And if you try to change the pay application to act as if you're entitled to it, it'll result in an immediate rejection of the pay application. It's just on the back page, on the schedule of values, identifying it, the percentage is complete, so they understand that you're still seeking to be paid.
That's a great clarification, George. Thank you. Okay, so another point to be aware of is you want to beware of a waiver by change order. So what does that mean? Before you sign any change order, you should ask several questions to make sure that before you sign that this is something that you want to sign and it covers all your bases. So first you want to ask, does the change order cover all the costs to perform the extra work? Does the change order provide an extension of time to perform the extra work? Does the change order account for any delay, impact, or extension of general condition costs that are associated with the change? These are all things you want to think about. You don't want to sign a change order that only provides for partial costs or the cost, but not the time. And if there are going to be any delays or inefficiencies associated with that that aren't accounted for in the change order, you're going to want to note that before you sign the change order, or you could be found later to have waived your right to seek any of those additional time, costs, or damages associated with the change. So if the answer to any of those questions is no, then you must, on the face of the change order, reserve your rights. You could include language, for instance, that the change order excludes all delays, disruptions, and inefficiencies experienced by the contractor to date and associated with that particular increase in the scope of work. That would then reserve your right later to seek delays or inefficiencies associated with the change that aren't captured on the face of the change order.
So let me, if I can just quick jump in here, Kathleen. So, so you have a change order request, right? Which you have priced up the value of the materials, labor, equipment to perform the extra work. And you asked for a time extension of 10 days. How many times have you received a change order back where they give you the money, but they don't give you the 10 days, or they give you something less than 10 days? If you sign the change order as is, remember what the change order is. It's a modification of your contract. So by signing it, you've agreed to it. The contract's been modified. You cannot later go back and say, well, wait a minute, I really asked for those 10 days and you didn't give them to me, so I have them. No, you don't. They will be considered waived. That's why Kathleen's raising the issue. If you answer those questions negatively, no, then you have to take another act, another step to preserve your rights on the face of the change order. You want to modify, put a little asterisk, and you outline exactly what is that you're reserving. Without doing that, it would be considered a waiver.
So what happens if you do this, you mark it up, and the owner will not accept or sign the modified change order? What do you do in that case? Here's a sample letter that you can send regarding the owner's refusal to accept the marked up change order. You could send a letter. Dear John, as you know, our change order request number blank contained a notation that the price quoted excluded all claims for delays, disruption, and inefficiency. You have advised us that the owner and/or architect will not process this change order request with that language included. As a consequence, XYZ Electric is resubmitting change order request number blank without that proviso. Nevertheless, this letter is intended to place Doe Building Corp., the owner, and the architect on notice that XYZ Electric's price for this change order excluded any and all claims for delays, disruption, and inefficiency, and reserves all rights to submit a claim for these costs at the end of the project. So that is what you do. If you mark it up, they won't accept it, they reject it, then you remove the language, and when you send back the unmarked up change order, you send them a simultaneous letter that says this: we tried to include this language, you wouldn't accept it, and you required us to remove it. Therefore, we are resubmitting it without that language. However, we are putting you on notice that nevertheless, we are reserving our rights to pursue those costs at the end of the project. So that's a great practice and what you should do when they will not accept a marked up change order. Next, we're going to turn to scenario 2. We just have a couple questions that came in about these recent topics that I think make sense to just quickly address at this point before moving on. So we got a question that does the sending a change order log with the invoice and listing them on the lien waiver cover this item in the same way. So I think that question is addressed in terms of listing it on your payment application. Can you send your change order log with the invoice, list them on the lien waiver? I think my answer to that would be that would be acceptable to do it that way, and listing them on your lien waiver is certainly something else that you absolutely should do to preserve your rights and to put them again on notice.
I agree 100%, Kathleen.
Okay. And then another question, should you do this before signing the partial release and waiver, or include it on the waiver as an exception? So I think that's the same idea there, that you want to, before you sign any releases, same as before you sign any change orders. If you're waiving anything where you're being asked to waive or release any rights, you want to identify any exclusions to that, any change order requests, any disputed claims that are out there. You want to identify them and exclude them from that.
And let me just jump in here as well, and we'll get this to the on the back end of the presentation. But these lien waivers that many of these CMs or upper tier contractors are requesting you to sign are very clear that in exchange for the progress payment, you're releasing any and all claims. Remember, a change order request is a claim. So to protect yourself, you need to reserve that right on that release, attaching your change order log that lists all the open CORs and specifically referencing it onto the release is a very effective way of indicating that you're not releasing those claims, which are CORs.
Okay, I think we can move on and we will get to any additional questions as we go and at the end. So scenario 2, I'll turn this over to you, George.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathleen. So scenario number 2 is that you and your client both agree that you've encountered a condition that is not contemplated by the contract documents. That's great. But the only difference is you don't agree either to the impact on time or the impact to money. You think the change is going to cost $100,000 and 30 days of time, and they think that it's only going to cost $25,000 and have no impact on time. In that scenario, it's common, and you see that all the time. So what do you do with that instance, right? They want you to get moving and proceeding with this work that everyone agrees is extra and that needs to be done. The way to effectively protect yourself is that you want the upper tier contractor to issue you a constructive change directive. A construction change directive is it's really what it sounds like. It's a directive issued by the owner to you or the general contractor to you, directing that you perform this extra work, right? And it leaves open how to pay for it and what the value is for a later date, right? Why do you think it's important for us to ask for a CCD? The CCD is a directive, formal directive to you, directing you to do extra work, right? The AIA in the general conditions A201 defines this a CCD. It's a written order prepared by the architect and signed by the owner directing a change in the work. Why is that so important? Well, I'll tell you why it's important. A CCD is an admission by the upper tier that what they're directing you to do is in fact beyond the scope of your contract. That's a point that's in place. And when you are in the beginning of a project and you're in the honeymoon stage of a project, right? It's easy, everyone's getting along. But I guarantee you, on the back end of the project, when you're in the divorce proceedings, right? And you're saying, well, I did this work and it was extra. All of a sudden, the CM is citing to some note on a reflective ceiling plan that you can only see if you hold it up to the light, where it says you owe them everything that they asked you to do as part of the scope of the contract. Or they'll cite to some obscure reference, either on a plan drawing, in a specification, to put the hook into the argument that what they asked you to do was base contract. And every time you allow your customer or your client to have a hook into that, do you know what that means to you? It means that it compromises the value of that you're going to settle for. It's just another hurdle. If you get a CCD, it is an admission that what they asked you to do is outside the scope of your contract. And so now you're only fighting over money and time. It's a huge thing. It's not a form. I don't need some special document, CCD entitled, but you need something in writing confirming that what they're directing you to do was in fact outside the scope of the contract. And that's the purpose of a CCD. So let's assume that you get it. You get the CCD, that's wonderful. Now what do you do with it, right? Well, the first thing you need to do with it as an effective project manager is you got to make sure that your home office is aware of it, because they need to put placeholders in your job cost accounting system that affects the cost as well as your schedule. And what does that mean, right? It means that you have to set forth and break out in your accounting system separate new cost codes for every element of the work that's necessary to perform this extra work, all the various construction activities. Then you have to communicate that, because we have great communication with our field, to the superintendent and foreman. They need to be aware of these new cost codes so that when they are in the field performing their work, and preparing their timesheets and their daily tickets, they can notify and record to those new job cost codes, right? So they can identify where that is. And I'll give you a perfect example of it. So for example, let's say you are performing work and you're putting flooring down in a particular room, right? And that's your scope, to put flooring in a room. And then you're directed to perform additional flooring in another room next door, an adjacent room. So what does your report show? If you say, well, we inspected the substrate, we put some sealant onto the substrate, and then we laid out the new flooring. As the representative of your client, and now we're in the divorce proceedings, the first thing I'm going to do is say, that's base contract work. And you're going to have that saying, no, 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 it's not. It's really for the time spent in doing the flooring in the adjacent room. Well, how do I know that? Remember, I'm the enemy. I'm there to push back and say, oh, you think you're owed another $30,000 for doing this additional flooring? And I'm going to come up with reasons why. One, I'm going to find some obscure note on some reflective ceiling drawing that tells me you owe me that additional floor. Two, I'm going to say that's all base contract. And so to way to protect yourselves, get the CCD, create the separate new cost codes, make sure your on-site personnel are aware of what those cost codes are so that they can properly secure and record that time to those cost codes. You can go to the next slide, Kathleen. So the next cost loads. And then finally, you have to make certain that your scheduler in-house has a placeholder in the schedule updates or your look-aheads so that you can account for what impact this extra work that you're being directed to do has on your schedule. And that's important because you need to know whether you're going to need to ask for extra time, right? Whether you need extra time. So you have to keep track of that, all right? So now let's assume you've got your CCD, right? You got it. You immediately put a placeholder in the schedule for your time. For your schedule impact. You broke out the various construction activities to perform that extra work. You have separate cost codes for each one. You've effectively communicated that to the field. So the field knows that when they're performing this extra work pursuant to the CCD, they are recording their time on their daily tickets, reflecting where they're doing the work and what cost code they're assigned to, right? That's very, very important. You've done all of that. Well, you had to find out, what are you entitled to, right? What are you entitled to be paid for this extra work? Is it just the bricks and sticks of doing the work? Or are you entitled now to some of your project management time? This is a classic problem that we all have. In all the claims that we assert, every contractor who's asserting a claim is trying to recover their project management time, right? But typically, most contractors, the project manager is part of the overhead. There's not timesheets recorded, and you lose that. The only way for you to recover project management time in dealing with this extra work is for there to be a time recorded by the project manager, and try to separate it out as a direct cost to perform the work as opposed to an overhead item. And that's why a lot of contractors lose the ability to recover the project management time, and which could be a significant factor in performing the extra work. So let's assume you did it right. You checked the contract. You know exactly what you're entitled to recoup to do this extra work. You've allocated. You told your project manager to make sure you record your hours in associated with dealing with this extra work, and you do all of that. That's great. And you've tracked all of your costs. It's all great, and the impacts of the schedule. You did everything right. Should you sign that CCD? Never sign the CCD. The reason you don't sign the CCD is because it may be interpreted as a change order. Classic example. The upper tier contractor will say to you, you have a fight. You think it's worth $100,000. They think it's worth $30,000. So they issue a CCD. Please proceed with the scope of work not to exceed $30,000. Sign here in return. There's a signature for you. It's all formal document. It looks like you're supposed to sign it. So you're signing, you send it back. You're thinking, well, I'm going to proceed to $30,000. Then I'm going to call time out, and I'm then going to have another conversation with my client. The client's going to say, what are you talking about? I interpret that to mean that you've agreed that you're going to proceed with the work not to exceed your cost over $30,000. And because you signed it, the scope was defined, the language was clear, and you signed it, I think now that's a change order, just like we taught initially. So that's why there's no reason for you to sign a CCD. You just need the directive, which is an admission that the work that they're directing you to do is in fact beyond the scope of the base contract. That's why we need it, okay? So now, you did everything right. CCD came, cost codes are laid out, schedule impact is accounted for as a placeholder. How do you get paid? That's the question. How do you get paid, right? So how do you keep track of your costs and notify the owner or the general contractor or the upper tier that what your costs are? Well, we know the answer. You have to keep your T&M tickets. So everyone on this webinar is saying, yeah, T&M, and you just kind of glossed over that. But what is T&M? What does T&M stand for, right? M, material, got it. Everyone's got that. Congratulations. What's time? Well, it's the hours you spent doing the work. What value is that time? You're thinking it's the value of the man that you're, or the woman that's doing the work. I, who am your enemy, is thinking it's the maybe it's a not prevailing rate, but maybe it's a a minimum wage. And you're thinking that's ridiculous. Well, is it? We don't have an agreement what time is. Maybe it's 8 hours, but what's the value? So how do you protect yourself on time? You should, as part of your contract documents, have a labor rate schedule. So everybody from PM, project exec, all the way down, if anyone's doing work, everyone agrees upfront what those costs are per hour. And that's what the value of that T is. So let's assume you've done that. You've done everything right. This contract you signed has a labor schedule, has all the rates on it. You have your men are preparing these tickets. They prepare a ticket on a daily basis. What should the tickets reflect? Well, manpower, time spent, what you actually did, supervision, materials. Yeah, of course, you do all that, right? The day. But is that enough? In my scenario where I asked you to do the flooring in the neighboring floor, unless you specifically identify on the ticket that it's in room B as opposed to room A, or pursuant to CCD 1, when I'm the lawyer on the other side looking at it, I'm going to say that ticket reflects base contract work. And now we have a fight. And that means your value now just went down for no other reason, because you on your end didn't do the most simple thing on the ticket requiring identification of where the work was done, and it was done pursuant to that CCD. So that's what the adversary will do to try to push your costs down, right? So that's what you want to do. All right, so now you've done that. You've laid it out. It's all done right. You've identified room B, the hours, the time, everything is laid out perfectly. What should you do with the ticket? Well, we know what they should do. We should have the owner or the authorized representative sign the ticket. Who is that? Who do you think that is? Who do you think that is? Is it the person who, if you're dealing with a multinational company, one of the top names, do you think that their founder is the person supposed to sign that? You need to read your contract. You need to find out who has been designated in the contract as the authorized representative of your client. Is it their representative in the field, or is it somebody else? And the reason why you want to do that is because we've seen on many occasions the ticket signed by somebody on the other side, and then the argument is they weren't authorized to sign the ticket. And now we're into another fight over who was or was not authorized, and did they have the authority to sign the ticket, and what does that really mean? Again, anytime I create chaos with you, it brings your value down. So just know who's authorized. And if it's not clear from the contract, send an email to your client. Is Bob authorized to sign tickets? You need clarification. What if the owner said, okay, thank you, you got the right authorized representative. He takes a ticket and he stamps it. And he stamps it for verification of time and material only. Some people think that's really a bad ticket. That's a stamp. It's a great stamp. You want them to stamp it, verified time material. Why? Because by stamping it, they can't fight you later in the divorce proceedings that you didn't spend 8 men on June 3rd putting flooring down in room B. They've acknowledged it, they accept it. So it's very important that they sign off on it, or if they stamp it, verify material only, it doesn't matter. If the stamp were to say something like, verifying your time and material, thank you very much for doing this extra work, but I never intend on paying you. Thank you for the donation to the project. And they hand it to you, I wouldn't care. I don't care, because all I need them to do is verify that on that day, I had that many resources on the job doing that precise work pursuant to that CCD. If they do, if you get that, they own it. They cannot escape it. What happens if the owner refuses to sign? They went to this presentation, another seminar, and they were told, don't sign anything. So that owner representative or GC representative has their hands up, walking away, backing up from your field superintendent, refuses to sign. Now what? He's not going to sign it. He's not going to stamp it. What do you do? Right? You have two choices. You can, because remember, your field superintendent is calling you as a project manager. What do I do? And you need to give some advice, right? So what is the advice that you do? One is, okay, you're not going to tackle the person with the ticket. You pull the ticket, fine. And you're going to have to send it to your client. You're going to have to send it either that day or within that week. You accumulate it and you send it, right? Because it is noticed to them. Remember what we said before. When you send a writing to your client, they have choices. Write back, say, thank you, it's exactly right. Or they say, no, that's not true. You didn't have 8 men on that day doing that work. And that's okay. It allows you to resolve the problem right then, right? But if they you give them a ticket and they say nothing, they will not be able to effectively argue in the divorce proceedings on the back end of the job that you didn't have 8 men in room B on June 3rd doing that work pursuant to that CCD. That's why it's important that they get the tickets, right? So what is the best practice to do this if they don't sign the ticket? Well, gather them up, send them in weekly or bi-weekly, or no longer than that, because if it gets stale, then there's an issue as to whether they were manipulated or not. So gather them up, send them in every single week, daily. I prefer by email. And if they don't dispute them, they own it. And that's exactly what you're trying to do. You want to give them an opportunity to dispute those tickets. And if they don't take that opportunity, they own them. All right. When the work is all done and the work's all complete, you gather all your tickets up, put your markup, right? And you're going to submit it and prepare a COR and submit it to the owner along with any schedule impact analysis to do that. And you'll submit it to the owner or the general contractor seeking payment, right? That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. Now, remember, at the beginning of this scenario, you thought it was going to cost 100,000. They thought it was going to cost 30. But when you add up all your tickets and add your PM time and do your markup, it turns out to be 110. What are you entitled to? 110. Why? Because you offered to do it for 100. They said no. We'll figure it out, and these are your actual costs. If it turns out to be 80 and not 100, you're only entitled to 80. But that's what you're entitled to if you follow these simple procedures. Okay. Now, what do you do if you put the change order in and it comes in at 110 or 100 and the owner does not issue a change order or wants to issue one for less than what you asked for? Well, you know what that is. You have a fight, right? You have a dispute. And you're going to have to know what the dispute provisions are in your contract and the claim provisions and have to follow them. If you sign the change order for a lesser amount or for something else, you own it. I mean, you settled it for that change order. Okay. So if you don't want to settle it for something less than your actual costs and that what you did, then you have a claim that you need to immediately file in order to preserve your rights, and you have a dispute. If you sign the change order for a lesser amount, you then own it. All right. Okay, Kathleen, do you want to go to scenario 3?
Sure. Okay, so our last scenario, scenario 3. Here in this scenario, the contractor believes that a specific condition was not included in the contract documents, requiring it to perform extra work. The contractor believes it is entitled to a change to the contract price and the contract time. The owner, however, believes that this specific condition was included in the contract documents. So the owner demands that the contractor perform the work. The owner will not agree to any changes to the contract price or the contract time. So here we have a disagreement. This is a typical scenario that contractors face all the time. Is the extra work included in the contract or not? In this situation, will the owner issue a change order? Will the owner issue a CCD? In this scenario, no, the owner won't issue a change order and won't issue a CCD because the owner doesn't agree it's a change to the contract. So what do you do in this situation? Here, you want to send a letter to the owner confirming your conversation. So here again, you want to document what you discussed with them to document the dispute. So you want to send an email saying, pursuant to our discussion, we encountered this condition. We believe it's outside the scope of our contract. You disagree in that regard. You want to state that the owner directed you to perform the work, even though the work is not included in your contract. So here again, the power is in your hands to document your position on the issue. State that you will perform the work under protest and that you will file a claim. Unfortunately, in this scenario, there's little more that you can do than to send that confirmation writing, confirming your position and the directive you were given, and then initiate a claim under the disputes or the claims provision in your contract. Here, it's very important you want to review the contract to ensure that you provide timely notice of the claim and fulfill all other conditions to file a claim. You want to strictly follow the claims procedure and the claims provision in your contract. That's very important. As a project manager, you want to be very familiar and understand the requirements, particularly how to provide timely notice of any claims and follow that procedure laid out in your contract. You don't want to get tripped up based on technical issues related to notice or failure to follow the claims procedure. Are you required to perform the disputed extra work while you are in the claims process? After you file a claim, do you have to proceed with that work while it's pending, or can you wait and hold off and wait for a decision on the claim? Most contracts contain a provision that require contractors to continue to work while claims are being decided. So here again, you want to review your contract, the contract documents for this provision, and see if that's in your contract. Regardless, the best practice in this scenario, the best course of action is to perform the work if it's financially feasible and maintain the complete and accurate records of the costs and the time to perform the work. Why is that the best practice in this scenario? If you don't perform the extra work, the owner will engage another contractor to perform it, and probably at a higher cost than it would have cost you to perform the work. And then you're going to receive that back charge for the work that you could have otherwise performed at a lower cost. Also, the owner may commence a lawsuit or arbitration against you for breach of contract to recover the additional costs, which may include delay costs associated with the time that it took them to engage another contractor. In Brunner and O'Connor on construction law, their provision regarding a contractor's duty to proceed with the change work provides that a contractor ordered to do work, whether as directed or constructive change within the general scope of the contract, typically is contractually obligated to proceed with performance of the ordered work pending resolution of any disputes over entitlement to amount or time. A contractor's unexcused failure or refusal to proceed in accordance with a properly issued change within the general scope of the contract constitutes a material breach. A contractor may safely ignore the directive to perform work only in limited circumstances when a change is clearly beyond the general scope of the contract, so it's not really a close call, or the changes clause is construed as requiring issuance of a written change order and no such order is issued. The order directs performance of work that is unsafe or impossible, highly hazardous, or the party giving the order already has materially breached the contract so as to justify a termination or rescission, or the order involves differing site conditions causing a material increase in the contractor's cost for which it refused to give an equitable adjustment. So the bottom line here, because of the risks involved with being second guessed later in litigation over breach of the duty to proceed with change work, you are usually well advised to proceed to perform the change work and follow an appropriate file an appropriate claim rather than refuse to perform, only in the most clearest and only for the most clear and most substantial of reasons do you want to refuse to perform. So scenario 3, last point here, you should track all of your costs and time just as you would if the owner issued a CCD directing you to perform the work. So here again, these will be important in proof of your claim, just like a CCD when the owner agrees it's a change, but there hasn't been an agreement to the time or the cost. You want to here very carefully track your time and costs, set up your separate cost codes, and prepare your T&M tickets with the appropriate detail and getting them signed, and follow those same procedures.
So look, we focus a lot on notice, but I want to make it clear for everyone. More and more upper tier contractors are including language in the contract that requires mandatory, strict compliance with their notice requirements. Otherwise, a claim is barred. And Kathleen and I can speak on a number of occasions in which the language is so restrictive that it's very, very burdensome to comply with. But you have to be aware of them. Some states, these notice provisions are strictly construed. New York, Virginia, Maryland. Some states, not so much, right? It talks about prejudice, whether there's actual showing of prejudice if you don't follow the notice provision. New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Well, what happens is this issue of notice makes up and eats up all of the costs in the litigation, which you really will avoid completely if you and your team are fully aware of what is required in terms of the notice. So please, 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 please underline 100 times. Know what it is. You will save yourself a boatload of money in legal fees if you simply comply with the notice requirements. If you don't, that's okay. There are arguments to get around it. It's just more expensive to do so. So please do that. Yeah, so let's try to avoid some of these self-created difficulties in getting paid. So when you provide these notices, we cite to the contract provisions the best that you can. If you're not quite sure of what the exact amount of money that you're exactly seeking, you simply say you're going to calculate when you do. What the impact on time, you don't know yet, can't be quantified. You'll let them know. Once you do that, you'll let them know. But you should quote to the contract provision and make it very clear that it's in fact a notice to get paid. Once you have concrete data on your costs and your time impact, you need to put that together and submit it as soon as you can. It's very important to do that for purposes of timing. So the best wrap up here, if I can, before we could try to answer some questions, I want to just kind of quickly resolve this, is it sounds simple. Understand your scope. Right? Make sure you understand it and make sure your field personnel understand it completely, what's going on. Know your notice requirements and what you need to do to satisfy them. Who gets them, when they need to be sent.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, that's my Apple Watch. When they need to be sent, who gets them. Critically important, track your costs specific to the extra work that you're being directed to do. It will make a huge difference in your ability to recover those costs if you track it separately as opposed to just clumping them in to the general base contract items. Be careful that you don't waive your rights. That's going to happen every single time that you sign a contract, right? And there's a lien waiver. There's always those issues in there. So just make sure you educate your personnel so you can advocate for yourselves. Always be professional in that regard. You should have, someone with a lot of experience reviewing your contracts. Don't think that you must sign every single contract as is, because we negotiate contracts constantly and they're always amended in the negotiating stage. Because in the beginning, remember, it's in the honeymoon stage. And there's a lot of modifications to these contracts can be made with respect to notice and how to get, what limitations there are on back charges. All of that kind of stuff can be negotiated up front to give you more friendly terms. All right. And I see, Kathleen, there's a bunch of Q&A. I want to be respectful of people's time. And can you, how do we pull that up, Kathleen, the Q&A?
Yeah, so.
I'm not sure where we left off in answering them and not answering, if we can.
Well, yeah, so I'll try and run through them here quickly. We did get a couple of questions, whether the PowerPoint will be available and whether this is being recorded if people missed a portion of it. Just want to answer those quickly, that everyone attending here will receive a copy of the PowerPoint, and this is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording. Substantive questions. Okay. First off, historically, when we submit a COR on a monthly invoice, the architect next in the food chain will reject the invoice, stating the COR does not belong on the invoice. What is the legal response?
The legal response is pretty simple. You're not asking to be paid on the COR. That's correct. If you're asking for money, it will be rejected. Putting them on notice, you could say see attached COR log attached to your pay application as well. And there's no legal basis to reject the pay application because you attach the COR log or identify the CORs.
Next, so many contractors have started using Textura, which prevents us from billing for change orders. We do the work. They can drag this on for months without letting us bill through Textura.
Yeah.
Then they try to knock off the cost by an arbitrary percentage. If we don't accept the 50% reduction, then you can't bill. We can send paper invoices, but they are ignored. What do you recommend?
This Textura is being used as a sword against lower tier contractors, right? Because it prevents you from inputting data into the Textura system. And that does not affect your legal rights. It simply does not. So if you cannot upload it on Textura because it's preventing you from doing so, then you need to do it old school way, sending it by paper directly or electronically to your clients. You have to protect yourself that way. If again, you're not forced to accept a reduction in the COR in the amount you're requesting, it's an issue of a claim. It goes back to a claim. And if they're starting to knock you down on legitimate CORs, on legitimate costs, then you know what the position you can take? I'm not going to proceed any further unless I have an approved change order on an agreed upon scope change, because your contract's going to allow you to do that, right? You can try and negotiate it. Force them to issue a CCD if you can't agree on a number, and then track your costs. If you do so, you're entitled to that money, irrespective of the Textura limitations.
Here we have a question about when the owner or the client accepts a signed change order request as the approved change order in order to avoid extra paperwork. If the owner or client in writing states to the contractor that a signed change order request supersedes a signed change order, would the signed change order request be sufficient documentation in order to be entitled to payment for the associated extra work?
Okay, remember what a change order is. It's a written document that's prepared by the architect, owner, GM, that lays out a defined scope of work, price adjustment, and time and schedule adjustment, signed by all parties. If you have that document signed by all parties, then I think you can consider that to be evidence of an approved change order. And I would just simply send an email confirming that the executed COR by all parties that defines all the things that we just said serves as a change order that can be billed in your next billing application. If they give you a problem with that and they play games with you, that's the end of that practice.
Next question, how would you address reasonably inferable language that some owners insist upon including as part of the scope description to argue about whether scope creep is a change, etc.?
That is a classic position that the upper tier will use. They'll say you are responsible for the scope of work that's set forth in the project documents, and that can be reasonably inferred from the project documents. They're right. That language is in your contract. The question is factual, whether the work that they're directing you to do is in fact reasonably inferable. If it is, because there's a particular detail that everyone knows that in order to install this element, it has to be done, then you may lose that argument. If what they're asking you to do is not something that is typically done to install the base contract work, then you would have a good argument against it. If there's an argument against it, whether it's reasonably inferable or it's not, then you're in scenario 3. You think it's extra, they think it's not. And then you need to protect yourself as we just outlined in scenario 3.
What if an owner directs you to perform a change but refuses to pay, claiming the work is a result of an error or omission?
Okay, it's a loaded question. If you have a base scope of work, it is what it is. If you perform some work that's in error, if you perform some work that needs to be removed and replaced, that's on you. That's clear. If they're directing you to do extra work and they're saying it's due to an error or omission on the design and you don't have design responsibilities, that's not your problem. That's theirs. You get paid for that work. If they don't issue you a change order, then that's scenario 1. Then you go into scenario 2. You demand the CCD. If they're not going to issue a CCD, then you're not under no legal obligation to perform work that is extra, that's beyond the scope of the contract. If they claim that it is in your base contract work and you think it's not, you're in scenario 3, which is you're sending that letter saying I'm doing it under protest, and you track your costs and submit the claim.
If we agree to 25% of the cost, is only the 75% disputed what the CCD should be for, or is it always a $0 CCD?
Be very careful in your review of the CCD language, right? So if you agree to something, you have to be very careful that that CCD understands that you're reserving the right as to the balance of the claim, right? That if you sign a change order for 25% of the cost that you submitted, if you put a COR in for $100,000 and they issue a change order for 25,000 and you sign it, you just bought it for 25,000 and you gave up the 75,000 unless it's specifically reserved. So be very mindful of the games upper tiers will play. Look at your language of your CCD very carefully so it's very clear. I'll accept the 25% now, but we're reserving our rights for the balance of the money. It's all about looking at the language and reserving your rights to make those claims.
Right, that's what George was talking about. You want to be careful that the language couldn't be interpreted as you agreeing to a cap.
Correct.
What if the owner refuses to sign the T&M tickets or signs them but writes on the ticket a note regarding they're not necessarily verifying the time and material? So that we spoke about.
Right.
We don't, if they stamp it with whatever they're going to stamp it, we don't care what they stamp it with. If they refuse to sign, try and reconcile with them. If there's an issue, you can resolve right then and there. If not, note on the ticket that they refuse to sign, and then you go ahead and you submit them, as George said, when you compile them daily or weekly, you send them in, and if they don't reject them, then they've accepted them.
Make sure you send them in, right?
Yes. Can't you just perform the work scope that you think you are under contract for?
You should always be performing work that you believe is part of your base contract. Of course you should be doing that. But the moment you think you're doing something that's beyond your scope of work, that triggers your claim because you want to get paid for it, which triggers the notice requirement of your contract that you need to send a notice in. But if you think you owe it, of course you're supposed to do it.
Right. And if the question is getting at the issue of whether you should perform work that you don't believe is part of your contract, that again is the risk that you want to be aware of in terms of refusing to perform. Oftentimes, if you refuse to perform, they're going to procure another contractor to perform that work and then back charge you, so that you want to make sure that it's only in the clearest of circumstances where you're refusing to perform.
And keep in mind, in my 35 years of doing this, I think I've instructed a client not to perform work that they believed was, outside the scope, and the owner thought it was inside the scope, maybe a half a dozen times. It just because the reason is we say that unless it's going to financially break you to do that, or really injure you to do that, you have the best of both worlds. If you perform the work and the owner is right, well, then you control the cost. So you just out of pocket your direct costs to do that work. If you do the work and you're right, well, you get paid for all of that work plus your markup. So it's a win-win for you on that scenario. So it's very, very rare we'll tell a client not to perform the work unless it's really a major item that's going to have a financial, very substantial detrimental financial impact on the client.
So last three questions, and then we will let everyone go. For scenario 3, if a submitted COR is submitted and denied, should you leave the COR open throughout the project construction duration?
If you have a COR that comes back and says denied, then you need to remember that means you put a claim in for COR, it's been denied. Now you are on notice that COR from the upper tiers perspective is a dead issue. That if you want to get paid for that disputed COR, you need to put them on notice. We dispute that denial. We will be submitting a formal claim on this at the conclusion of the project. And then you just accumulate them on the back end and you try to negotiate them all out as part of the closeout. But yes, there's nothing you can do. You did the work, and you have just make sure they know that you're looking to get paid for that. You don't agree with the denial.
Is the cost of tracking a claim reimbursable in the claim?
It's going to depend on what your contract says.
Yeah.
When you say the cost of tracking a claim, there's a lot in there, right? Is it part of the overhead that's doing that? Or are you talking about the field guys spending an extra hour properly documenting the cost coding? If the guys in the field are doing it, it's going to be much more of a direct cost. If it's the back office doing it, maybe it's more overhead. But if you can track it, separate that out, then I would include it as part of the claim for sure.
With cost of materials constantly rising, when should the owner be notified of impending cost increases? And what,
Immediately, as soon as you know them, immediately. Nothing gets better with age. So the moment you know this, as costs are, they're going through the roof right now. Costs are out of control. Those of you who are involved in having to get anything with resin are familiar with the events that happened in Texas and the two major resin plants that went offline. That's having a rippling effect all through the industry with anyone needing resin product. You're talking about 80 to 100% increases in cost. Lumber is going up, at a rate that we haven't seen in a very long time. So what do? Once you're aware of it, you need to put them on notice immediately if you think you can see to recover the cost of that.
great. And that would include, there was a cost increases due to COVID, the same would apply.
Right. Right. So I'm looking at that in writing, Kathleen. So remember, the force majeure provision in your contract deals with time. It gives you an excuse due to acts of God to your performance, right? It doesn't address the price escalation, cost escalation of your materials. You would need a material escalation clause in your contract to permit that. If you're doing work for like the DOT, NJDOT, there's a price escalation clause for materials. You can have that relief. If you don't have that in your contract, then you have different arguments to try to recover the cost increase, but they're hard to get because the issue becomes who bears that burden, and it's an issue that's we're seeing very commonly now.
We also have a question that came through in the chat. If you have a contract with a public entity and they request additional work by force account, you are not in agreement with the costs associated with the change order.
Mm-hmm.
Are you required to do the work, or are you permitted to refuse the additional work?
No, you must proceed. That's why they have the force account provisions in those public contracts. It's the same issue. You're directing to do the work. You need to perform that work. You need to track your costs to do so, and you can't walk away from it. Especially with the public work where you have a bond, you're going to get into an issue where they're going to claim that you're in default. If you don't, they can make a claim against your performance bond, and that's not something that you want to do. A lot of owners, whether public or private, in order to extract some leverage on the lower tier, will notify the surety just to put pressure on you to do that work. So the key is, if you can afford to do it, to do the work, track those costs, submit those costs, and get paid for those costs because you've done everything right to protect your interests.
Last question. When being asked to do extra work, do you have rights with regard to the time frame of the work being done? In other words, can we enforce a schedule for the extra work based on the time frame we are able to do it, even if it varies from what the owner or the contractor wants?
All you can do is you send in, if you're asked to do extra work, you tell them it's going to take 30 days on the critical path of the project. It's going to extend the critical path, or it's going to extend my duration, and that's what you're asking for: time and money. If they refuse to do that, they're saying, I'm sorry, I can't give you 30 days, you have to do it in 10. Then the question is, are they asking you to accelerate that work? Are they asking you to work premium time to accelerate? Because that goes into the cost. So you have to do the work when you can do the work. If it's something other than what you would normally do in a normal duration, and you have to accelerate, that's all part of the cost that you're seeking to recover.
Okay, great. Well, if anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to email us directly. As I mentioned, we're going to be emailing out a copy of this presentation, as well as a copy of the presentation slides.
Listen, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. And thank you everyone for attending. I know it's everyone's busy and we're doing these webinars. You can tell from the way Kathleen and I present this particular part, we are very passionate about this because I can only tell you, and please be mindful of this. So we represent 1,200 contractors. All the cases are generally the same. It's about doing work, not being paid for it, and being impacted. And I will tell you, 99% of these cases could be resolved without a lot to do if everyone, the project managers, did what they were supposed to do as a good project manager. Know the contract terms, know your scope, know what the notice requirements are. Don't be pushed around. You don't have to be. Protect yourself, reserve your rights, and at the end, you will be entitled and will recover all that you're entitled to. Okay? So thank you, everybody. If you have any other questions, please reach out to Kathleen or I. We'd love to answer them for you, and we'll get you on the right path. And hopefully we'll see you all in April.
April for part 2. Yes. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.